Ezzard Charles is recognised by most as history's greatest ever light heavyweight, yet around his excellent endeavours at 175 pounds, he was a reigning world heavyweight champion and actually beat some of the greatest middleweights of his era. So just how good is his resume? Is he potentially the most underrated great fighter in history? And did the Cincinnati Cobra compile a resume deserved of tons more respect and recognition? So once again, using EV Boxing's formula, I'm going to dig into the resume of history's great old fighters. My last video was Harry Greb, and now let's dig into the career of Ezzard Charles. So Charles started his professional career in 1940, and he is a prime example of how tough the 1940s era was, because within a year and a half, he was completely thrown into the deep end, taking on Ken Overlin. The 17-0 Charles would take on the 151 fight veteran Overlin. But what makes this more impressive is that Overlin had only lost the middleweight world title in his last fight just a few months earlier. It was a title in which he had retained twice, but he'd only lost twice in his last 36 or so fights. So a 19-year-old Charles, just a year and a half into his career, was taking on the #1 middleweight in the world behind the champion. He would lose via unanimous decision to Overlin, but this would be an A++ opponent if we were counting it, which we're not because he lost. However, Charles compiled 2 more victories before scoring the first notable victory in his career at 20 years old when he defeated Teddy Yaros. Yaros was middleweight world champion from 1934 to 1935. Now, what's worth noting is that he was one of the men that had beaten Ken Overlin 2 years prior to their fight with Charles. After beating Overlin, the next month he would beat Archie Moore. He had a fantastic resume. He had wins over guys like Billy Conn, Lou Brouillard, Babe Briscoe, multiple wins over Ken Overlin, Solly Krieger. And in 1940, he had defeated the Hall of Famer Lloyd Marshall. He had lost a couple in the fights leading up to Ezzard Charles, to Jimmy Bivins most notably. This was his second to last career fight, but he was still mixing it with top guys. A world level operator, Yaros is going to go in the A+ tier for the 20-year-old Charles. Just 2 months later, Charles would defeat Anton Christoforidis. Now, the year prior, he was the light heavyweight world champion. Now, in the last 2 years prior to this fight, he was coming off a victory against Seferino Garcia, middleweight world champion, Jimmy Bivins, Emilio Bettina, the light heavyweight world champion. He had just lost the title to Gus Lesnovich, but he had never been stopped in 62 fights. Charles TKO'd him in 3 rounds. Now, this is a young Charles here we're talking about, TKOing these top guys. So this, again, is going to go in the A+ tier. He's already toppled champions from middleweight to light heavyweight at 20 years old. And just 2 months later, Charles would take on Ken Overlin again, taking him to a 10-round draw, just showing how quickly he has developed. So within 6 months, he's taken on 3 different champions in the one belt era, defeating 2 and scoring a draw against 1 from middleweight to light heavyweight. We don't score draws, but that's some run. Now, as I say, I haven't actually brought this up in this video, but I did in the Harry Greb video, is we're going to skip past a lot of the names that there's not a lot of information on. This is a long time ago. The records aren't as easy to attain as they are for fighters now. So he had scored another victory against Billy Pryor, who he won't rank, before suffering the second defeat of his career to Kid Sonero. But he would bounce back with some of the greatest wins on his resume. Now, still at 20 years of age, Charles took on Charlie Burley back-to-back. Now, Charlie Burley, if you haven't heard of him, is widely regarded to being the most avoided fighter of all time. He was the best fighter of the Black Murderers Row. He beat guys like Aaron Wade, Holman Williams a bunch of times, Burt Lytell, Archie Moore, Jack Chase, Aaron Wade. He beat Fritzy Zivic, the former welterweight champion of the world. Coco Kid. I mean, Charlie Burley was a phenomenon. There are so many legends that have said that Burley was probably the greatest fighter to never win a world title. You could probably chuck Sam Langford in that mix, but Archie Moore, who boxed Charles a bunch of times, Muhammad Ali, Rocky Marciano, Patterson, said that Burley was the best fighter he ever faced. Burley had scored 50 career knockouts. He was slippery. He had knocked out heavyweights, despite really being a blown-up welterweight. He had won the coloured middleweight title. He was just a phenomenal fighter. And he was well established in his career by the time Charles had stepped into the ring with him. He was a nightmare opponent with 57 fights. His record was 51-5-1 when Charles stepped into the ring with him, and Charles beat him twice, back to back. Those are two S-tier wins for a 20-year-old Ezzard Charles, who is still campaigning at middleweight at this point. Now, Charles turns 21 and wins 4 more fights before taking on the future light heavyweight king, Joey Maxim. Joey Maxim would beat so many great fighters. He beat Gus Lesnovich, Bob Satterfield, Jimmy Bivens. He would famously have a victory over Sugar Ray Robinson when Robinson had gone up to bid for his light heavyweight titles and collapsed due to heat exhaustion. Maxim also defeated the future heavyweight champion Jersey Joe Walcott when he had lost to Ezzard Charles. He was still relatively early in his career. He had only had 25 fights. Now I'm going to put these in the A tier because Maxim, likewise, was still relatively early in his career. He's still boxed top fighters at this point, but he wouldn't go on to be a world champion for another 8 years, where he would really score some of his best victories in the late 40s. So these 2 victories that Charles scored back-to-back again are going to go in the A tier. Now, Charles actually lost to a couple of the most fearsome light heavyweights of his era back-to-back. He had lost to Jimmy Bivens, the Hall of Famer, over 10 rounds and was stopped in 8 rounds by Lloyd Marshall, having a record of 30 wins to 4 defeats and 1 draw. But that is a bit of a turning point because now Charles goes on his incredible peak, which is arguably one of the greatest peaks in history. So this is Charles' transition to light heavyweight, which is where he left his legacy as the greatest light heavyweight ever. So when it comes to his light heavyweight run, I'm going to break down his opponents one at a time. He did fight them sporadically, sort of around each other. But after suffering those defeats, he scored 7 back-to-back victories before he defeated Archie Moore. Archie Moore is in my top 10 greatest fighters of all time. He was the light heavyweight champion for 10 years across the 50s. He won the title from Joey Maxim. But the first victory here was in 1946. And what makes Moore's story so fascinating is that for over a decade before winning the title, when he was 38 years old, he won the title. He was mixing it with so many of these great fighters. Archie Moore, as I say, is in the top 10 of all time pound for pound in my list. He would go on to have one of the most phenomenal reigns in his 40s. He had already had close to 100 fights by the time Charles fought him, beating all of the Black Murderers Row, Jimmy Bivens, Lloyd Marshall. Now Charles beat him 3 times out of 3, 2 on points, 1 via knockout. Now Moore had lost 14 fights by the time he had the last fight against Ezzard Charles. Obviously 3 of those were against Charles. Now after those Charles fights, Moore would lose to Leonard Moreau and Henry Hall, but again he would beat both of those guys, scoring a knockout. I mean, he scored 132 career knockouts. It's just insane. And he did suffer 2 more defeats in that time after, but both of those were via disqualification due to low blows that he was throwing, so that it's not necessarily that he's being beaten. He's just losing via DQ. Charles' last victory over Moore was in 1948. The Lloyd Gibson defeat to Moore, which was via disqualification, came at the end of 1948. After this, Moore would go on a 14-year stretch in his 40s where he would have 100 fights and only lose 5 more times in his career. One was another disqualification due to low blows. And the other guys that beat him were Harold Johnson, a Hall of Famer, Rocky Marciano, the heavyweight champion of the world, Floyd Patterson, the heavyweight champion of the world, Giulio Rinaldi, and Muhammad Ali. Now that's actually over a 14-year span, where across that time he avenged the Rinaldi defeat. He scored the greatest come-from-behind win ever in history against Devon Durrell for the title. He had dropped Rocky Marciano. He had beaten Balbo Olsen, Harold Johnson, Joey Maxim, Jimmy Bivens multiple times, amongst many others, and basically cemented himself as one of the all-time greats. So I think these 3 victories, considering the form and the resume Moore had afterwards, and just the level of competition he had already been in with before, makes these 3 victories for Charles S+ victories. These are historic wins, and in my opinion, beating him 3 times out of 3 are the best wins of his career. Charles would also go on to avenge his loss to Lloyd Marshall by knocking out Marshall twice. Those 2 victories would come within a year of each other. Marshall would knock out Freddie Mills in that time, who was a world champion level fighter. He had already beaten Jake LaMotta, the Black Murderers Row guys. This is an A++ victory twice for Charles. And Charles would defeat Jimmy Bivens 3 times. In the next 3 times they fought, Bivens had freakishly long arms. He had beaten so many legendary light heavyweights. He had beaten Gus Lesnovich, Joey Maxim, Ezzard Charles, of course, Anton Christoforidis. He had knocked out Archie Moore and Lloyd Marshall. He's a member of the Hall of Fame, one of the all-time great light heavyweights. Again, this is going to go in the A++ tier for Ezzard Charles. Now, around these, Charles actually suffered the only defeat of his prime years in over 40 fights to the murderous punching heavyweight El Murray via split decision. El Murray was 6'2", huge compared to Charles, and Charles would avenge this defeat, knocking Ray out. So because of the size disadvantage and the fact that Ray was such a huge puncher, he had 69 knockouts in 98 wins, I'm going to put this in the A+ tier win. Then there was heavyweight contender Joe Baxey. Charles would TKO him in 11 rounds. This is going to go in the B tier for Charles. And it's actually worth noting that Charles, who was a devastating counterpuncher and a real spiteful puncher, had tragically taken the life of one of his opponents, Sam Barudi, in this time. And after this, Charles would never quite have that same instinct to finish opponents. He would openly talk about how he struggled with this victory. Now, in terms of judging this as a victory, it would go into B+. Not that I'm inclined to really put this in, considering how the fight ended. But Barudi had beaten Bob Satterfield via knockout and Holman Williams. Holman Williams is a legendary fighter. But yeah, it's just a tragic part of Charles' career. And it would show why he would begin to slow down in the ring. Charles now had a fantastic record of 61-5-1. By the time he fought Maxim for the 3rd time. He defeated Maxim again over 15 rounds in 1949. This was just before Maxim was about to become light heavyweight champion. Charles beat him 2 more times during that time period as well, scoring a total of 5 wins out of 5 against one of the great light heavyweight champions at the time. Those 3 victories against Maxim are going to go in the A++ tier, considering Maxim was the light heavyweight world champion of the world throughout those years. Now, what's crazy is Charles is a 68 fight veteran by this part of his career. He has already defeated the previous champions at light heavyweight in Anton Christoforidis. He's beaten Joey Maxim, who will go on to be light heavyweight champion 5 times out of 5. He's beaten Archie Moore, who would hold the title for 10 years 3 times out of 3. And he's beaten many of the Hall of Famers in Lloyd Marshall and Jimmy Bivens, and he will go on to defeat more. He's still got more light heavyweight world champions to defeat. But this run at light heavyweight, plus the middleweight running, where, in his teens and his early 20s, he beat some of the greatest middleweights of his time and the middleweight champions. He's never even got a title shot. So he decided to move up to heavyweight, where he would challenge Jersey Joe Walcott for the vacant NBA heavyweight title. Joe Lewis's last 2 fights before retiring initially were to Jersey Joe Walcott. Now, many think that Walcott deserved to win the first fight, although Lewis got the verdict. Lewis would avenge the rematch via knockout. However, after Lewis's retirement, the NBA heavyweight title became vacant. There was no current active champion boxing. So Charles and Walcott fought for that title, with Charles finally getting a title shot and winning the heavyweight title against Jersey Joe Walcott. Now, that is an A++ victory. We're sort of jumping a little bit here, but Charles will go on to defeat Walcott again for all of the heavyweight titles after he won them outright. So I'm going to put those Jersey Joe Walcott victories in the A++. At the time, Walcott had become the oldest man to win the heavyweight world title. He was 37 years old when he eventually knocked Charles out. They fought 4 times. Charles won the first 2 and Walcott won the second 2. So in order to beat Charles with that knockout, I think it's one of the greatest knockouts ever too. And then to go on and be up on the cards against Marciano, Walcott was in some of the best form of his career. And he was a fantastically skilled fighter that arguably deserved to end Joe Lewis's reign. The first defense of Charles' heavyweight title came against Gus Lesnovich. And again, this is another world light heavyweight champion. He was the light heavyweight world champion for most of the 40s. Lesnovich had won the titles in 1941 and held on to them until 1948, which is basically Ezzard Charles's prime. Charles never got to fight Lesnovich during those years, but when he did eventually fight him, defending his own title at heavyweight, he stopped Lesnovich in 7 rounds. This was the last fight of his career. He had lost the light heavyweight titles the year before to Freddie Mills. He had also lost to Joey Maxim. He had knocked out Billy Fox, Tammy Moriello, Melio Bettina, and of course beaten Freddie Mills in 1947 and 1948. So he was still notching up top victories the year before this fight. But I'm going to put this victory in the B+ level for Lesnovich. And then there was Pat Valentino. He had been a top 10 contender at the lower part of the top 10 across 1948 to 1949. A tough fighter who Charles knocked out defending his title. This is going to go in the B tier. Then there was a defense against Freddie Bashaw. He would go on to lose to Joe Louis, Don Cockle, Harry Matthews, and Marciano. Most of the top guys of his era would beat him. He's going to go in the C level. And then Charles scored the biggest name on his resume. Joe Louis came out of his 2-year retirement to put all the titles on the line. The NYSAC, the Ring Magazine, and of course, Charles' NBA heavyweight titles. Now, Louis was 36 years old here. He wasn't the Louis that you saw in the Marciano fight that was completely shot, but is undeniably past his best. But he had a 33-pound weight advantage going into this fight. He was still a very skillful fighter. And he would go on to win 8 fights after this in a row, beating names like Jimmy Bivens. Jimmy Bivens was past his best. He also stopped Lee Savold before obviously losing to Marciano in his last fight. Now, of course, this isn't in the S tier. Louis was the most famous boxer ever by this point, probably the greatest boxer to ever live by this point alongside Sugar Ray Robinson. But he wasn't the same force. He was huge compared to Charles, but Charles had such a great resume, was used to fighting bigger people. I think I would probably put this in the A+ tier. It's still a fantastic win. Louis had gone undefeated for, I believe, 14 years with the 2 years out going into this fight. Although he had arguably deserved to lose against Walcott in the first fight, he had scored a victory in the rematch. You know, this is probably one of the curses of Ezzard Charles, is that he succeeded Joe Louis. Joe Louis was the most popular fighter ever by this point. So Charles, who had slowed down that killer instinct after the Barudi fight, wasn't necessarily the most out there character, a very respectful man, was a pure technician but not the bulldozer like Rocky Marciano that would excite everyone. It's one of the reasons that he's underrated and people don't remember how good he was. Charles would successfully defend the heavyweight titles 4 more times, 2 against fighters I'm going to put in the B tier in Lee Omer and Nick Baroni, and then of course his final 2 defenses against Jersey Joe Walcott and Joey Maxim that I've already ranked in the A++ tier. And this ends the dominant peak of Ezzard Charles. He would lose via knockout to Jersey Joe Walcott, losing his heavyweight titles. He had successfully won 9 out of 9 heavyweight world title fights before this loss. Now, he would still score more good victories. He would TKO the heavyweight contender Rex Lane. That is going to go in the B+ tier. Now, the reason I put him there is because he would go on to beat Charles. He went 6 rounds with Rocky Marciano. He knocked out Bob Satterfield, beat Jersey Joe Walcott, obviously had beaten Ezzard Charles again. Charles scored 2 victories over Lane that are going in the B+ tier, and he also beat Joey Maxim for the 5th and final time that I've already ranked in the A++ tier. He beat Jimmy Bivens again, but Bivens was towards the end of his career now. This is going to go in the B+ tier, and he beat Coley Wallace, who was a respectable fighter. He had beaten Rocky Marciano as an amateur, but that's going to go in the C tier. And then Charles knocked out Bob Satterfield, who was one of the great punchers of his era. Jake LaMotta said he was the hardest puncher he had ever faced. But Satterfield lost to a lot of the top guys, so he's going to go in the B tier. Charles, by this point, had a record of 85 wins to 10 defeats. His dominant prime was over, his heavyweight run was over. However, he had one last hurrah in the bank. He faced heavyweight champion Rocky Marciano. Now, Marciano would always say that Charles was the toughest fighter that he ever faced. They fought twice simultaneously. Rocky obviously won both fights, but Charles put up a great fight in both. In the first, he was the only man to ever take Marciano the full 15 rounds, and it was a really good fight. And in the second, Charles had actually cut Marciano's nose, a really brutal cut, which the doctors had said that Marciano was 1 round away from being stopped, which would have meant that obviously Charles regained the heavyweight titles. And I mean, how different would history have been if Rocky wasn't able to find that stoppage? The cut was horrendous. Charles would have been the first man in history to regain the heavyweight titles. Rocky wouldn't have retired undefeated. However, Rocky showed his class as a champion. And that would really be the end of Charles' run at the very top of the sport. He did go on to defeat Vern Esco, who was a C-level fighter. He was the Canadian heavyweight champion. But after that, Charles had developed ALS, which was a crippling disease. He was completely crippled and in a wheelchair, and he passed away in his early 50s. It's a terrible end to such a great fighter. His peak, he was around 71 wins to 5 defeats and 1 draw. Had he have retired then, he would have had 9 successful heavyweight world title wins in a row. He would have the greatest light heavyweight run ever and would have beaten many of the great middleweights of his era. It's basically an emulation of the run Roy Jones Jr. went on, with about 10 times the amount of wins against Hall of Famers. And although he had suffered more defeats and went on a little too long, after the second Marciano loss, he would have had a record of 85 wins to 12 defeats and 1 draw. Sadly, he boxed on for another 5 years after the Marciano fights and lost 13 more times, which I think with how little people know about Charles does affect his legacy, because I think people just look at his record, which was 95 wins to 25 losses and 1 draw. He was stopped 4 times towards that back end of his career. He lost 3 fights in a row multiple times. He lost twice in a row multiple times. It's just such a shame fighters of that era would have to carry on, usually due to financial reasons. But overall, across his career, and as I say, I don't judge every single opponent he faced. It's too difficult to find records of these old guys as a fight is coming up or keep busy fights. So you can assume that there are more C-B level fighters that I've missed out, meaning Charles' score will be exponentially higher. Overall, Ezzard Charles defeated 11 different Hall of Famers 19 times, which is amongst the highest in history. He also defeated 10 different world champions in the one belt era. In his career, he scored 3 S+ victories against Archie Moore, 2 S victories over Charlie Burley, 10 A++ victories, 3 against Jimmy Bivens, 2 against Lloyd Marshall, 3 against Joey Maxim, and 2 against Jersey Joe Walcott, 4 A+ victories against Teddy Aros, Anton Christoforidis, El Murray, and Joe Lewis, 2 A-level victories against Joey Maxim, 5 B+ victories against Sam Barudi, Gus Lesnovich, Rex Lane twice, and Jimmy Bivens, 5 B-level victories against Joe Baxi, Pat Valentino, Lee Omer, Nick Baroni, and Bob Satterfield, and 3 C-level victories against Vern Esco, Freddie Bashaw, and Coley Wallace. And that gives Ezzard Charles an overall score of 220 points, putting him second on the EV Boxing leaderboard, and of course the Harry Greb video I've already done. That is all for this video on Ezzard Charles. Make sure to watch EV Boxing's original resume series. It's fantastic. Let me know which old school fighter you want me to cover next.